Justice Corbett began his talk by talking that he'd be concrete and practical. And I tend to be abstract and theoretical, but I'll try very hard to be clear. Jovan asked me to explain the notion of discrimination based on multiple bases, or intersectionality. And intersectionality, and I want to start by doing that. Intersectionality, the word intersectionality comes from the notion of an intersection, like roads crossing, between two or more kinds of discrimination. And the theory of intersectionality was developed in the context of sex discrimination and race discrimination. And I want to describe it first in that context, and then explain how it affects an understanding of the rights of sexual minorities. How, when you add the intersection of sexual orientation or gender identity, gender association, how that works both the same and differently in the intersectionality analysis. So let me begin with the simple observation that when people talk about blacks and about women, they often think about black men and white women. And they think of discrimination as being based on sex, if men and women are treated differently, and based on race, if blacks and whites are treated differently. So, to be a little concrete against my basic nature, this bottle represent sex discrimination, and this is race discrimination. The paradigm of example that we think of is discrimination against white women and discrimination against black men. And what about black women? Are they going to be victimized by race discrimination or... Thank you. If they're being discriminated against, is that a form of race discrimination or a form of sex discrimination? There was a famous book that has been translated in a number of languages. All the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. The beginning the talk about black women. And there was actually a case in the United States that carried this segregation between race discrimination and sex discrimination to the point at which there was a company that hired disproportionately discriminated against black women. And the court threw the case out of their concern because the allegation was of discrimination on the basis of race and sex. And the court said that unless you can show that you're discriminated against on the basis of race or on the basis of sex, you don't have a claim. To give you a claim would make you a superclass, as though being discriminated against is a great benefit. But the idea of it being two different groups, and race discrimination is one thing, sex discrimination is another, led to the dismissal of that case because the company involved could show that they hired a reasonable number of white women, and they hired a reasonable number of black men. They just didn't hire black women. But since they hired white women, they couldn't be discriminating on the basis of gender or sex. And since they hired black men, why they weren't discriminating on the basis of race. And that's what the extreme example of failing to consider intersectional discrimination does. It also creates, to use an important metaphor of intersectionality, is the image of there being the privileged society of those people who are not discriminated against. And you can imagine it being a room full of people who are basically privileged. And underneath that room full of people, the metaphor goes, are the minorities of all different groups who are discriminated against for one basis or another. And in the case of race and sex, the black women are at the bottom of the basement. And standing on their shoulders, we have black men and white women. And the black men and white women who are singly discriminated against can sort of be trying to get through the basement floor to join the non-discriminated against groups. And there can be a kind of competition of which kind of discrimination are we going to try to end first? Who gets priority? Who gets admitted to the group of non-discriminated against, that is, privileged people? Why, the women or the blacks? And of course, one rather easy answer is, well, if the black women get admitted, then you've solved black discrimination on the race and sex at the same time. Maybe. There are other courts that said, if you can prove a company discriminates against black women, that doesn't tell you a thing about whether they discriminate against black men. Black women can't represent all blacks in a lawsuit, kind of class action lawsuit that brings bigger remedies. And similarly, if you have a case of sex discrimination, why, that can only be brought by white women, because black women can't represent white women. Well, why not? You have to be either black or white. Why should white women be the norm and black be the other, who can neither represent women nor represent black people? Only by the blatant concept that there are blacks and there are women. And the blacks are all men and the women are all white. The second metaphor I want to go through, and then we'll apply it we'll bring in sexual discrimination on the basis of sexual minority. If the woman is smashed in an intersection, let's go back to the metaphor of an intersection, of a traffic intersection. There is sexism coming in one direction. Sexism coming in one direction. Sexism coming in one direction, racism coming in another direction, and there might be homophobia coming in yet another direction. And she's smashed. Should she have to identify which kind of ism it is that was the cause of her discrimination, of her injury? Or should we look to the injury itself? And the answer of intersectionality is that you should look to the injury itself. And in some cases, it's perfectly appropriate for black women to represent all women, or for black women to represent all blacks, or for black women to be able to claim that they are injured on the basis of the combined categories of race and sex. So that's the basic idea of intersectionality. It's particularly important in terms of sexual minorities. To some extent, there's a parallel. I saw some literature talking about women and sexual minorities, very much the way we talk about blacks and women. And in the context I read it, it sounded as though the women they were talking about were heterosexual women, and the sexual minorities they were talking about was gay men. But it's more complicated. And the basic concept of LGBT starts with lesbian as a way of countering the intersectionality problem, of making sure that lesbians don't get left out. Because lesbians are gay women, and so gay could cover lesbian, but recognizing that otherwise they might be omitted. The LGBT terminology is itself an effort to deal with the problem of intersectionality. The other thing that makes it a little bit different in the case of intersectionality, a little bit different when we're talking about sexual minorities, is, as many of you know, there have been countries that have made it a criminal offense, or as, again, Justice Corbett put it, they've no, excuse me, the gentleman talking about Cameroon said that in the Cameroon, they'll lock up people, especially men, for engaging in a homosexual act. And there are countries where male homosexuality has been outlawed and female homosexuality has been ignored or used for pornographic purposes. So it's not as clear. In the case of blacks and women and black women and white women and black men, it's more clear-cut that the black woman is at the bottom of the heap. Although sometimes black men were more subjected to violence on the basis of the kinds of lynchings that were all too common in my country. But usually the hierarchies were fairly clear, and they were somewhat separable, although certainly there's a relationship between sexism and racism. The relationship between the discrimination on the basis of sexual minorities and sexism is much more straightforward and important, it seems to me. Usually, if women as a group are treated much worse in a society than men as a group are treated, that society is very likely to be homophobic. That is simply an observation I've made across the world. Similarly, the more equal men and women are in society, the less homophobic the society is likely to be. When gay men are insulted or taunted, or when boys are teased on the basis of questioning their masculinity, they're called the names of girls, and that's considered an insult. Sexism is intricately related to a lot of hostility to gay men. Moreover, both sexism and homophobia protect and construct a particular kind of aggressive masculinity, a very limited, unappealing form of aggressive masculinity. And homophobia is a mechanism for enforcing sex roles. Sex roles are forced on men and women, upon girls and boys, to a large extent by the kinds of taunts and fears of not fitting your sex role. Am I being ladylike enough? And men's masculinity can be challenged, and women shouldn't be challenging their masculinity, or that's a basis for violence against them. Parents all too often give very different toys to boys and girls, and if the girls are tomboys, it'll be tolerated for a while, but after a while they start worrying about wanting to make sure that their girls are properly ladylike, especially if boys are attracted to toys considered proper for girls, not boys, or colors that boys aren't supposed to like. It's the sense that there's something wrong with my child if he is gay, or even the refusal to even admit the possibility of children being gay, that fuels this kind of parental oppression of people's desires and interests, starting from childhood and proceeding through adolescence and into adulthood. And so the relationship between homophobia, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or discrimination against sexual minorities, and feminism is a close one. And anybody who is concerned about the role and status of women, certainly all feminists, should be warm supporters of the rights of sexual minorities. And within the movement in favor of LGBT rights, it's very important that sexism be taken seriously, be recognized as a possibility and taken seriously, because the movement itself will be much stronger if it can unite and not allow the prejudices that society at large has to play themselves out within movements that are trying to end one form of discrimination. The discriminations reinforce one another. We should not be competing regarding which discrimination to end first. It's essential to end all of these forms of discrimination, before there will be a reasonable society where we can be united and happy, and where children and adults do not have to be in a closet or disguise or be ashamed of how they are, where, as Justice Corbett suggested, it's safe to express your sexuality. And one effect of that will be, in a society whose homophobia is largely based on ignorance, which is the impression I have throughout the Balkans, actually, certainly here in Montenegro, it's largely based on ignorance. If and when a larger number of gay men and women can come out, discrimination will end much more quickly. It can end very, very quickly. When people who are ignorant about homosexuality, all over the country, they are all going to find out, if people come out, they're all going to find out that they have good friends, they have favorite uncles, they have favorite nieces, nephews, parents who are gay, and that they didn't know it. It is amazing how ignorant straight people can be about gay people. And I think the prospects for real change are really much even more I'm even more optimistic than many of you are about the prospects of change and how quickly some of this change has come about. Thank you very much.